I will be telling you about my paper Screening with Franz, which is joint work with Denis Shishkin. Now, the starting point of this paper is that the way choices are presented to individuals affects the choices they will make. So, for example, when options are framed in terms of gains instead of losses, people will be much more risk averse. But what happens when the framing changes? Well, when the framing changes, so do the choices. Now, these choice reversals may very well induce dynamic inconsistency. Now, our question today is, what happens when a firm which has the power to frame the decision and the options of a consumer in different ways uses this power? Is it true that you always want to present the options in the best possible light, or is there something more clever that a firm can do? Now, in particular, what we look at is a model of monopolistic screening where the principal designs not only the menu that is at the disposal, but a whole extensive form decision problem with a frame potentially different at every decision node. Now, from a more bird's eye perspective, such violations of dynamic consistency are common once we go beyond the fully rational single agent. That can be because of behavioral biases, or that can be because the decision maker really is a group and not an individual. Now, in these settings, the literature has studied what happens and how to exploit dynamic inconsistency. But it is focused on the situation where this pattern is given by preferences. So it's, for example, beta delta or temptation, where initially I'm in a cold state, but once I am in the situation in a second period, I will be in a hot state. Now, what we are asking here in this paper is what happens when the principal can design not only the decision problem given such a pattern of taste changes, but the designer themselves can choose the pattern of taste changes. Now, you can think of it as an explicit designer choosing the framing, which pattern is best, or you can think of this designer as a benchmark. What is the best for the designer? What are the range of options that can happen? Now, in particular, you might ask, is it true that a simple structure is enough? So, for example, 2 stages or 3 stages, or with this power to move around tastes of the decision maker, do we need a very intricate structure to gain all the benefits? And so what we'll also do here is take a more single agent, multiple self-mechanism design perspective on the problem, trying to figure out what is actually the best pattern of taste changes, the pattern of taste change of the most implementation power, so to say. Let me give you a quick preview. We'll show that in the optimal contract, or more generally by a designer, framing will be used not only to make the options more attractive, but also to induce dynamic inconsistency and use that to bypass incentive compatibility constraints. Is it true that with this power anything goes? Not exactly. In terms of the outcomes, so the cues, the quantities in the screening setting, yes, anything goes, but not all contracts. So the transfers will be limited. I will show that a simple form, a simple canonical form, just using 3 stages and 2 frames will be enough. So there will be an initial interaction in the highest possible frame, a controlled cooling off period in the second highest frame, and a closing stage again in the highest frame. And this form will be able to implement anything that could be implemented in any complicated structure. Now, in particular, going back to the monopolist screening problem, there will be a trade-off between surplus maximization, which means presenting the products in the best possible light, and surplus extraction, that is using the change in frames in order to extract rents. Let me skip the related literature in the interest of time and jump right into the model. We'll have a space of contracts, a one-dimensional outcome space, which we'll call Q, already hinting at the application to monopolist screening, and a space of transfers on the real line. An agent has a type theta in cap theta and will be finite. The type itself is not enough to tell us what choices the agent will make. We also need to think about how the options are framed when the agent encounters them. So there will be a finite set of frames, cap F, and the frame and the type together will give us the utility. In particular, it takes this quasi-linear form where theta and f together determine a payoff type, theta f, and given the payoff type, we have a normal single crossing structure with some regularity conditions here and a normalization of what happens at 0. We'll have script E, which is a set of extensive forms with frames. So think of a perfect information game tree, and that every decision node will have the frame that this decision is set in. In particular, we don't allow any chance moves, so everything will be deterministic. And as a participation constraint, the outside option is available at every node. So that means no matter what the decision is made so far by the decision maker, unless he's committed to one outcome, can always opt out. And as a solution concept, we'll look at sophisticated agents. So they will correctly anticipate what their choices will be. They'll choose the continuation problem according to their current tastes, their current frame, but they won't have any commitment power beyond that. So again, thinking about this as multiple selves, you can think of a subgame perfect equilibrium of this game. Now, we say that an extensive form decision problem implements a contract if the contract is an outcome of this decision problem. Now, let me tell you how things work in a 2x2 example. So there's two types, alpha and beta. Alpha will be the high type, beta the low type. And there's two frames, a high frame and a low frame. We'll work with a linear utility here, and you see the payoff table right in front of you. Now, what would a principal do if they're trying to sell the good and they're producing this good at quadratic cost? Well, one thing they could certainly do is simply give a static menu that is just a set of options and pick a frame for that menu. Now, it's easy to see that you always want to choose the highest frame, and if you do that, you can do the math, you get a payoff of 20. Now, is there something more the principal can achieve? Yes, indeed, there is. Suppose you would know who is who at the cost of putting the low type in the low frame, but putting the high type in the high frame. So that's the first best of the problem with two types, alpha in the high frame, beta in the low frame. Well, then you can pick out the contracts. One thing you'll notice immediately is that here, of course, the high type, who gets 0 surplus, would like to imitate the low type. So this vector of contracts does not satisfy incentive compatibility. Still, we can implement it. How can we do so? Well, we construct this decoy. So in this extensive form, the low type prefers most his own contract, C hat beta L. It's the full extraction contract, he gets 0, but all the other contracts give either 0 as well or negative utility. So the low type just continues through to C hat beta L. What about the high type? Well, for the high type, we construct a decoy, the alpha, which is more attractive than C hat beta L in the high frame. So at this terminal decision problem, which you would need to reach in order to imitate the low type, he would pick the alpha. Now, going one step back, the way we constructed the decoy D alpha, it's actually less attractive than the outside option in the low frame. Oh, but one step before, the imitating high type is in the low frame, so he would opt for the outside option instead of continuing. Well, but then from the perspective of the root, even trying to imitate the low type is equivalent to choosing the outside option. So that is never attractive. And we can choose C hat alpha H, which is the full extraction contract for type alpha in frame H. So in other words, by using the decoy and putting the low type in the low frame on the path to his contract, we've managed to bypass the incentive compatibility constraint. And doing so, the principal actually gets a higher contract. So it turns out this is the optimal thing to do in this example. Now, let's move to the general case. What assumptions do we make? First of all, we want to stay in a one-dimensional environment. So what we assume is that the frames are ordered irrespective of the type. So pick any type, there will be some frames that give them a higher valuation, some frames that give them a lower valuation. Well, that's exactly the same for all the other types. So I can order the frames by the valuations they induce. Now, similarly, I can order the types, no matter what frame it is. One type will always be the highest, next the second highest, and so on. Now, and of course, we have a non-triviality assumption. For further reference, let me denote the highest frame by H and the second highest by L. I'll sometimes say the low frame, but I still mean the second highest. Now, a definition that's a bit of a mouthful. What is a standard EDP? Standard EDP just has 3 stages and uses 2 frames. Now, when you encounter standard EDP, 2 things can happen. There is one set that is theta r, the so-called reveal types. These types get their contract immediately at the root. And there is a set of concealed types. Those are the types that have their separate continuation problem, like the low type before, and they get their contract in this continuation problem. So there is the root in the highest frame with the contracts for the reveal types and the continuation problem for every concealed type. The continuation problem starts in the low frame. There is decoy contracts, which are meant to throw off deviators, here for all the lower types. Then continuing on into the last stage, there is the contract for the reveal type that's intended to go into this continuation problem, and decoys for higher types, just as we saw before in the example. Maybe graphically this is clearer. So here we have a standard EDP where theta 1 and theta 4 are concealed, and there is decoys at the intermediate stage for all the lower types, and at the final stage for all the higher types. And with that, we already get to the main theorem of our paper. Take a non-negative contract. So that's a contract that implements a non-negative quantity. Now, if the outcome space is sufficiently rich, the following are equivalent. If a contract is implementable, then I can implement it in a standard form, in a standard EDP, just as I described it for you before. Now, furthermore, I can also give you a characterization in terms of constraints. Simply put, for all the concealed types, I can replace incoming incentive compatibility by a stronger participation constraint, namely in the second highest frame. So what do we see from that? First of all, no matter how complicated the setting and what the contract is, I just need these 3 stages and 2 frames to implement everything. Now, secondly, we can remove all incentive compatibility constraints if we choose so. So in particular, if you have a vector of outcomes, of queues that you like to implement, maybe it's not monotonic, so if you have all the incentive compatibility constraints, that wouldn't work for any vector of transfers. Here we can do it. So whatever your favorite vector of queues, we can find transfers that make it implementable. Now, if we dig a little bit into the standard form, you'll see that it is the increase in tastes, so going from the second stage to the final stage, that allows us to throw off downward deviations. And it's the decrease in tastes, going from the first stage to the intermediate stage, that will allow us to throw off upward deviations. So that tells you about what kind of taste changes you need in order to bypass which incentive compatibility constraints. Just a couple of words about how we establish this. First of all, when you have any extensive form decision problem, there's got to be some frames. So there's got to be some frame at the root, and the loosest participation constraint is the one in the highest frame. So this constraint is a given. Also, if a contract is available at the root, then incentive compatibility has to be satisfied. If it's not available at the root, well then, who knows about incentive compatibility? But there needs to be a different frame, so there needs to be one more participation constraint. And so that's essentially how we get the necessary conditions. For the sufficient conditions, we have to construct decoys. In particular, we have to construct decoys both for upward and downward deviators to make sure that these deviations are impossible. I think I do not have time to go into this in more detail. Let me tell you a little bit about the application we make to monopolist screening. There, the principal commits to a mechanism and wants to maximize profits. And the one deviation from the more general theory is that now we impose a lower bound on quantity. So you can think about the outside option as not buying anything. Well, then the monopolist cannot offer less than nothing. Now, this lower bound may interfere with the construction of our decoys. That's why we had the sufficiently rich domain restriction in the theorem before. And what we show for this application is that for the optimal contract, this lower bound is never binding for our decoy constructions. So the optimal contract here is implementable in a standard EDP. Now, going into the contracts a little bit, this move of concealing a type, of putting the type in the low frame on the way to the contract, replaces exclusion. If I have this trick to get rid of all the incoming incentive compatibility constraints while still extracting some surplus, that's what I'm going to do instead of not selling them anything. So every type in the optimal contract is sold a strictly positive amount. Now, finally, we look at two extensions for this example. We look at the case of naive consumers. So what happens when they don't understand what will happen and instead move towards the contract they like most from their current perspective, thinking that their tastes in the future won't change? Well, then we can use similar methods to achieve actually full extraction. So there we use decoys as well, not as poison pills to make sure to keep them out, but as bait to lure them in. And we also look at right to return legislation. Now, let me conclude. What we've built is a model of screening with frames and extensive forms, where the key idea is that the principal can design the extensive form not only to present the products in the best possible light, but in order to induce violations of dynamic consistency and use those to bypass incentive compatibility. Now, what we've showed is that every implementable contract can be implemented in the standard form. So even with this large power to potentially use very complicated structures to eke out the advantage, a simple 3-stage 2-frame structure is all that is required.